It's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 205, July the 14th, 1975, out here this afternoon. I'm trying to survive various assaults, one upon my head, which I had 5 weeks ago. I'm still lightheaded. I was knocked down, and my head was stomped on. I had surgery on my jaw this last week, and we'll have some more the next week. Poison oak, mosquito bites, and flea bites. But if that isn't enough, I wake up on Sunday morning in Carmel to find that Major General Mae Brussell, one of the men who ordered the murder of DM, lives in Monterey, California, and the assassination teams, at least overtly, seem to move right close to your front yard. I remember the first Dialogue Conspiracy I did 4 years ago in the spring of '71 when the Pentagon Papers broke. And I explained that the truth someday would come out that the CIA was involved in the plans to murder DM, that they were behind that assassination. And I just noticed yesterday in our paper that a South Vietnamese general who was behind the orders to kill DM now lives in our neighborhood. He's living with his sister in Monterey, California. The summer woes, I classify that, I guess, along with the mosquitoes and the poison oak and everything else, as something that we have to live with and understand, and see how many of these Vietnamese assassins are brought into this country, those related to drug importations and the Phoenix program. I read when I came into the KLRB that there's a memo in the Rockefeller report to remove Mr. Colby as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency because of the assassination of 30 or 40,000 persons in the Phoenix operation, and at the same time the suggestion or the whisper is to remove Mr. Colby. We're importing the very people that did the assassinations. This is one of the inconsistencies of our government, which I cannot understand, or the Congress and the Senate, to allow these things to happen. We should not bring war criminals into this country until we find out what happened over there and what basis they had for murdering these people, and maybe they should stand trial in their own country, as some Germans did at Nuremberg. Not enough of them, but some of them. I did want to talk today about Mr. Butterfield being named as a possible link of the White House to the CIA by Fletcher Prouty this week, but I'll have to do more of that next week because I have some other matters that I think are more important. I did mention in my Realist article 2 years ago in the summer of '73 the plans to remove Richard Nixon out of the White House, and that if necessary he would be assassinated. And in that same article I brought up the subject of who would assassinate him. I talked about Mr. Al Wong of the Secret Service, who worked with James McCord and Alexander Butterfield, that knew every room that Richard Nixon was in and the bugging devices, and that the lectures I gave in the last couple of years, I've said that Nixon could be removed by the White House tapes. This would be the role that Alex Butterfield would have and could have, and he didn't have to be assassinated. Once the assassination money could be linked to the Watergate team, they couldn't go ahead and murder him because payments had already been made to murder Richard Nixon, and by producing these tapes, Richard Nixon was sure to be out of office. Alex Butterfield was on the national television denying his role in this political operation, but I also listed in that same article how you recognize espionage operations, clandestine operations, and one of the ways is the constant denial, such as John Mitchell denying he knew the people involved in the Watergate, and another is disavowal. Mr. Butterfield can say, I didn't know E. Howard Hunt at all, but it would be very hard to believe that because under the grand jury testimony, E. Howard Hunt testified in December of '73 that he had a separate recorder machine and a bugging device in his own desk put in by Al Wong of the Secret Service inside the White House. And if Wong was receiving the tapes from Hunt, it was receiving the tapes from the White House from the President of the United States, and Butterfield was in charge of these operations and a Secret Service operation there of the taping. He must have known that Howard Hunt was also taping inside the White House if the machinery was set up by Al Wong, who worked with Butterfield. There are many other reasons for knowing that the men would probably have to know each other, but the disavowal, "I don't know you," is easy on national television. It isn't in a courtroom under sworn testimony, and any perjury wouldn't be prosecuted anyway. The article that broke about the CIA infiltrating the White House mentioned that they infiltrated the Office of Management Budget. In that same article in the Realist on page 23, under Institutions to Dismantle, I listed the Office of Management Budget, and I also listed DALE, D-A-L-E, the Drug and Law Enforcement Agency. And this was also mentioned this week as being infiltrated by the CIA. Alexander Butterfield is the agent from the White House who may have been under the salary of the Air Force. He was in the Air Force, and Victor Marchetti and various persons in the CIA have said that you can still be in the CIA and lose your relationship to the agency and take on a new identity. So at the time of the White House tapes being disclosed, he was, in quotes, in the Air Force. But he was also sent to the Department of Federal Aviation. He had been deputy assistant to Nixon, and then he began to head Federal Aviation December 19th, and Dorothy Hunt's plane crash was December the 8th, and it was a very quick transfer over to transportation to investigate the murder of a very high operative of the CIA. If he didn't work for the CIA, it's interesting that he was investigating or on top of the assassination of one of their highest operatives. There also was a comment about DALE, as I say, the drug enforcement, and there was a comment or affidavits the CIA was infiltrated by one of the vice presidents of CBS. It's interesting to know that Michelle Clark of CBS was on Flight 553 when Dorothy Hunt was murdered, and that CBS ordered her body cremated immediately without any word of the family's consent or otherwise, and one has to ask if a high CIA operative is assassinated, why is a co-worker or somebody with her cremated, and how does CBS have the authority? And this is where the links of the CIA infiltrating these agencies and offices becomes important, because they're being able to manipulate not only people but the evidence after the crashes or the deaths take place. Also working for DALE, the Drug Enforcement Agency, which these documents say were infiltrated by the CIA, was Harold Metcalf. Now, he sat on the same plane as Mrs. Hunt, Dorothy Hunt, on Flight 553, and he told the pilot that he was carrying a gun and he was assigned to seat B-17. Coincidence with the new song, popular song about B-17. Mr. Metcalf sat on seat B-17 next to the stewardess, and he wore an outfit that would allow him to leave the airplane. He sat near the food galley, and after the crash, he was wearing a jumpsuit. Former military intelligence investigator, he identified himself as Harold Metcalf, who was an overseas CIA parachute spy. So a representative from CBS was on that fatal air crash. An airplane, somebody from DALE Drug Enforcement was on that fatal airplane, and a member of the CIA. And then Mr. Butterfield was sent over to Federal Aviation. Also in these documents of the CIA infiltrating the White House, they mentioned that an agent infiltrated the Commerce Department. But 2 years ago, I said that Mr. Butterfield was a very important man to the whole removal of Richard Nixon from the White House, the way he was slipped out of power to make way for Gerald Ford and Rockefeller. Who was the agent in the Commerce Department that they are admitting now there was one agent? We know there are more. First of all, the Commerce Department handles all the funds and budget for the Central Intelligence Agency in Virginia. It goes under the Commerce Department. But if Butterfield was important there, who was another agent? One of those, whose name you may not remember, is Ed Failor, F-A-I-L-O-R. And there are articles about Ed Failor, July 12, 1973, in San Francisco Examiner, and I'm sure they were on the wire services. He worked for CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president, and he set up a shop across the alley where the Democratic Convention headquarters were. And he now is a high official in the Bureau of Census in the Commerce Department. But we know he worked with Creep as an espionage agent. He operated from the Fontainebleau Spa in Miami Beach. He rented electronic recording and transmitting devices to be used in the hotel headquarters. And at the time, he was a special assistant to campaign director John Mitchell. His office had a rent-a-cop that they sent out. They had cops that they rented. There were guards at the door. It was a secret espionage operation across from the Democrats with 20 to 40 people in the operation. Definitely hush-hush with 7 or 8 guards. The Democrats wanted 100 rooms, extra rooms at the Fontainebleau that were suddenly withdrawn from then 2 weeks before their own convention down in Miami. The Republicans would have one later. And it was soon learned that Mr. Failer, working from the Interior Department at that time, he's now in Commerce, had taken those rooms and charged them to the White House so that the Democrats couldn't use those 100 rooms. Failer bugged the Democratic offices. He sent a message to Nixon and San Clemente 24 hours in advance that Eagleton's name would be on the list of those heading the vice presidential nomination. And Failer also knew at that time that Eagleton had a drinking problem. And there was a quotation in this article: he was very, very happy at the nomination of Eagleton. He went on to see the demonstration at the Doral Hotel of the hippies that Failer said couldn't have been staged, but which Frank Mankiewicz said the demonstration looked phony. Now, Failer was rewarded for his hatchet job by becoming head of the Commerce Department, the Social and Economic Statistics Administration. And this was in Jack Anderson's column, June 21st, 1973, that he headed a mysterious attack group, that he was a political hatchet man, and that Mr. Failer then went on, as his reward for being a hatchet man, this is Jack Anderson, to head the Commerce Social and Economic Statistic Department, and his budget there is $100 million, and he controls 7,000 employees. And part of this Department of Commerce is he will supervise the Census Bureau and other vital statistic units. And there was an allegation that he was put there because of his clandestine work to make economic picture look rosy for Richard Nixon. But that's a tremendously important job. And who else was in the Commerce Department? Another agent was placed in the Commerce Department immediately, and not coincidentally with Mr. Failer. Tom Charles Houston was put there, and you know he headed the terrible Houston plan, the military police plan that John Dean smuggled out of the White House, and the control of blacks and minorities and genealogy through the Commerce Department is a very sensitive position. And this is how the infiltration of the CIA takes over our various cabinet positions. Maurice Stans was Secretary of Commerce before he left there to go to Creep, and then it turned out that he had given illegal CIA money to the re-election of Richard Nixon. I have an article dated June 15th, 1973, that Maurice Stans built up a $1 million fund out of taxpayers' money while at the Commerce Department to aid Nixon's re-election. You see how important it is to weed out these CIA people that are taking funds, such as the money the CIA sent to Greece that I talked about last week or the week before, and then they give it to the military dictator there, who gives it to Tom Pappas, who comes home to give it to Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew. When Maurice Stans was Secretary of Commerce, and it's alleged that he took $1 million in taxpayers' money while at the Commerce, and it went into the re-election of Richard Nixon. And again, they talk about CIA infiltrating Office of Management Budget that was run by Roy Ashe from Litton Industries, and it was that office that was a conduit of money, Roy Ashe's office, the Litton Industries, to overthrow Greece and put in a military dictatorship. And the Office of Management Budget has been a conduit and does work closely with the CIA. So the story of Butterfield being the link to the Central Intelligence Agency that came out by Fletcher Prouty has to be taken seriously, because Mr. Prouty is a very conservative, fairly straight person, and when he says something, believe me, he's checked it out I know that there are very few of these allegations that he's made, considering how much he knows about what's taking place in Washington. And he claims that Butterfield was the CIA contact in the White House, and it's consistent with the fact that there were assassination plans to get Richard Nixon. And when they were linked to the Watergate entry and the funding from the Mexican money to Houston, to Miami, to Washington, to New York, then the assassination was called off, and Richard Nixon was taken out of office because of the tapes. I have a news article here that the major networks are going to back off the JFK assassination conspiracy. I don't know if this is too early to announce it, but I'm really excited. You know, I announced a month ago, that I was going to do a series continuously about CBS until they put their documentary on about Gerald Ford and the portrait of the assassin. And I have done several parts of that, and every week I say we'll go back to Gerald Ford's book, and last week we did a little bit of it, and hopefully next week we'll get back to it. But here's a news bulletin saying the major networks back off on the JFK assassination conspiracy. 3 weeks ago, we reported that CBS and NBC television networks were doing extensive research for one-hour specials on the JFK murder. We have now been updated from CBS. 60 Minutes has discontinued their research, while the attorneys at NBC advised the network not to run a completed segment of The Tomorrow Show. Now, The Tomorrow Show was Tom Snyder with a gentleman named Mr. Morris, R. Morris from Tennessee, who did work into the gangland connections of Mafia chief Carlos Marcella with the political conspiracy, and with his chief lieutenants David Ferry and Eugene Brading. And Mr. Morris made a tape to be on NBC, but the show has been canceled and NBC will not show it. But it's interesting that CBS, I hope, will not go through with the Gerald Ford book and will keep hammering away in the weeks to come with evidence to prove that they would only be covering up the cover-up if they continue with these kinds of lies. And now so much information is coming out about the Kennedy conspiracy that will make CBS look really bad. When I came back from New York, where I was there, I spoke to Mr. Moses from CBS, Harry Moses, and he'd been in Dallas for a few weeks, and he was doing a documentary on Oswald. And he asked me for some information, and a lot of the researchers were very cooperative with him. And I was the only one, according to what I've talked to them, the ones that I've talked to, I was the only one who said I really wasn't interested in talking to Mr. Harry Moses. I told him why. I told him that he takes witnesses and asks the wrong questions, and he doesn't ask the right questions to the right witnesses, and that CBS had sold us the Vietnam War and Cambodia and Laos and the Holocaust in Southeast Asia, plus the Kennedy story that Oswald did it alone, and that I wasn't interested in cooperating in any of their movies or any of their television work, because for my part I just boycott it totally and tell other people to do the same. And I gave him examples and read him documents that I have in the house on why they pervert stories, how they do it, and that it was a very serious matter and I didn't want to be involved. Then last week I talked to two people at CBS. One is Bernie Birnbaum and one Jan Bartels, that were supposed to do a 30-minute segment of Oswald. And I, again, read them a lot of information on the telephone. I sent them one document from my files and gave them another side of the story of Lee Harvey Oswald that they have never delved into, never dared to admit or investigate. And I'm very, very pleased. I hope it's true that they're not going to do these shows, because no show is better than the lie. At least they won't hamper the researchers and try to cover up like they did before. They could do a show using my research. I said just once, why wouldn't you try using these documents? Why wouldn't you once give an exploratory show using the information that can be documented as much as anything you have that you put on your shows previously? And they weren't about to do that or to come out to California and use any of these documents. But I'll be very happy if they just call off their shows. That's what I wanted. That's what I'm working for. Hallelujah. Write to them. Tell them nothing is better than lies, and support the no-show theory and let it go at that. There's another news broadcast going to another subject. A detective agency has been working in Houston, Texas, and with headquarters in Puerto Rico, and they claim they've cracked the John Kennedy assassination. The firm is known as Security Associates International, and they said their clients, who they won't name, hired them 2 years ago to look into the Kennedy assassination. Now, this is interesting about the clients that they won't name, because I'm going to speculate and throw out a theory. I do it all the time after I have enough documentation to a certain point. The man they've hired is Pepper Crowder, Crowder. He says he has considerable new information proving that Oswald did not shoot the president or anybody else in Dallas. He said that certain federal agencies were involved in the assassination theory and that their evidence proves that the single bullet theory as reported by the Warren Commission is incorrect. This agency is known as Security Associates International. They have done work in Houston for 2 years with oil and chemical industry, and they're a reputable firm. They were even written up in the Houston Post. A friend of mine and a radio fan sent me a letter this week from the Houston Post that they are going into this matter. Well, people who live in Houston could get an earful because John Connally had strong links into Houston, Texas at the time of the assassination. There was a specific bank that was used in Houston, and I have the name of it, that was involved with the Kennedy assassination, and it would link to the Watergate money that came from Mexico up to Houston at the time of the Watergate arrests. Besides the bank links, there is the firm of Brown and Root, major contractors that built the tiger cages in Vietnam, made huge profits in Vietnam War, and a person who used that agency as his cover, George DeMohrenschildt, and I'll talk more about him later if I have time, was Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA contractor babysitter, and every few weeks George DeMohrenschildt would leave. DeGoyer McNaughton, he had an office as an engineer, oil engineer, and DeGoyer McNaughton hired another agent, Paul Rygotorodsky, who had close ties in Houston too with these people. DeMohrenschildt went back and forth to Houston for his assignments and his money. He was the man, as I say, in control with Oswald. He left Texas in April '63 and didn't show back. He's teaching in Texas now, but he disappeared when the assassination plans got thicker and heavier. He didn't have a role in the placing in Dealey Plaza other than helping introduce Lee and Marina Oswald to Ruth Payne, who had placed Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. DeMohrenschildt, who was going to Houston, Texas for his money and directions every few weeks regularly, was the only link besides Marina Oswald to the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald never saw or allegedly that he even owned, and he also is the only link to the Major General Walker shooting, which Oswald didn't do. DeMohrenschildt was very important to the cover story, and I hope that the links in Houston, Texas will go to George DeMohrenschildt, Paul Rygotorodsky, Leon Jaworski. Jaworski was head of the Anderson Foundation. The CIA, he was on the board of directors. He was an attorney for them. He was on the Warren Commission. His job was to represent the state of Texas insofar as the Warren Commission is concerned. Houston is important for their bank, for Leon Jaworski, for the links of Brown and Root, and let's see what they come out with later, but these are what I think are the Houston links, the important Houston links. So when this company comes out with their report, which will be very soon, those will be the links that I think you will find. The Mexican money and, as I say, the banking, Leon Jaworski, Brown and Root, George DeMohrenschildt, and Paul Rygotorodsky. Now speculation, who is behind this information? Who's bringing down the federal government? There was a news bulletin tonight by Ron Dellums. If you really find out who killed the president, President Kennedy, the American government will be shaken to its foundations. Who's behind the Houston group exposing the federal government? I would just speculate, that even though this is a security association that has done business for oil and chemical industries, that it has to be a branch of the Hughes organized crime group that got infiltrated from both working in Dallas and in Houston and down in Puerto Rico and near Cuba, that I said peacefully, there's no peaceful solution to opening up the John Kennedy assassination, or the fact that Howard Hughes doesn't exist, or the use of the CIA for domestic assassinations and using Howard Hughes' organization as a front for some of them. I believe that a branch of organized crime such as the names that come through all of this as these exposés come, is going to bring down the intelligence agencies that use them. And if we look far into it, and I've predicted murders, entanglement between the CIA and organized crime, that some element of that branch is now servicing and exposing and putting up money to expose the people who hired them or use Jack Ruby or asked them to help with the getaway cars. And the role that organized crime had in the Kennedy assassination was the use of Jack Ruby and the flying away of the real assassins and the teams of assassins. And that was their branch. Each person in the intelligence agency was assigned a need-to-know basis, and that's where the organized crime came in, the use of Jack Ruby and his family, and shooting Lee Harvey Oswald to conceal the real people who planned the assassination. Crawdaddy has a cover this month, an article called The Whole Earth Conspiracy Catalog. That's the work that I was doing at the time that Watergate broke. I was putting together and still want to do what I consider the Whole Earth Conspiracy Catalog. I'd asked Stuart Brandt if he would help me, the man who got out the other Whole Earth books. He wasn't interested, and Paul Krasner sent me this article today from San Francisco, and he said it's a shame they're doing your idea. I've spoken of the Whole Earth Conspiracy Catalog, and it is a project I want to do of various books that are out, 300 to 400 books and organizations and theories, and put together a resume of the work that's been done so far. This is about a 10-page article. It's got the addresses of various people you can write to. It's got some important questions to ponder, questions which I've asked on the air and I've asked in my article. Some of it is a put down. There's 8 questions, Stalking the Wild Conspiracy, 8 questions to ponder. It's got 8 theories to ignore, and it's got the list of various organizations. It describes Mae Brussell, writing for The Realist, as the conspiracyologists, if they were ranked like records in a billboard, would be about number 8 with a bullet for sheer notoriety alone. Brussell has built quite a reputation researching the common patterns and personnel involved in political subterfuge, extending beyond assassinations to the SLA, Watergate, police provocateurs, and other political dramas. Her work leaves many answers unquestioned. That may be a put down. I take it as a compliment because I've given the answers and I've found the research. And for every person that's gone into investigating my wild, what you call your wild allegations, the answers that were asked filled in. I gave the conclusions, and they were the right questions, and the answers came in, and they filled in the details of a lot of the research that I've done. So if the answers are there and they're unquestioned, then those of you who listen, take the answers and do your own research and fill it and find out any area or wild speculation that's far off and see where it leads you, and you will be shocked to find that it lines up with the actual documentation and evidence. I feel that some of the things I'm saying are too far out for my coworkers and researchers to comprehend or understand, but I did write to Mark Lane and Richard Popkind and Don Freed this week and asked them for a letter of apology for some of the sneers and remarks they made after Boston at the conference there, in lieu of the material that Richard Popkind is sending out as factual information now that I was trying to explain to them in Boston and they wouldn't use. I'll read to you a little bit more. I'd mentioned it last week, 2 weeks ago, a news report by Richard Popkind, one of my fellow researchers, and this is one of the areas he has a news bulletin this week on the new information that a Puerto Rican, whose name I have, and I'll withhold it until he breaks it or until I have further permission to release it, was arrested in the Philippines for allegedly plotting to assassinate President Marcos. I mentioned this before on the air, but I want to fill in more of the details. This gentleman was administered truth serum because he was listed as an illegal alien down in the Philippines. And in the course of hypnotic sessions, he said that he was a pilot for the Bay of Pigs, that his plane was shot down, and that the CIA rescued him. And when the CIA rescued him, they didn't take him to a normal hideaway. They took him to a special training place where he came part of in their hands, and they turned him into a program killer. Now, remember last week we talked about the news article from the London Times that the CIA was running, or Navy intelligence, 2 schools for known murderers. They would take murderers out of the stockade or people killed in war, and they trained them to be political assassins. And one of the schools was in San Diego and one was in Naples. I guess that was 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry, 2 weeks ago on Dialogue Conspiracy. I talked about that Navy intelligence school, one in San Diego, one in Naples, that taught known killers to kill more. And you can see that after Bay of Pigs, the humiliation and the defeat, that these people were natural to be used for the Kennedy assassination to get even with John Kennedy. Now, Popkind alleges now to have thousands of pages of documents about this particular person and the particular operations. And he said that the CIA at that point turned him into a program killer. And he claims that he was involved in the Kennedy assassination, that he was taken to the Dow Tex building, which is directly behind where John Kennedy's head was, and that 7 gunmen were used in the assassination. He remembered 2 of the names of people that were with him. One of them he remembered was Clay Shaw, and the other was a name which is new to conspiracy theorists in terms of the John Kennedy assassination, but the name came up, and I have it, and again, I'll wait for Richard Popkind to put it on the air, or I called him and asked permission for me to use it on my show, because the name is a man who worked with Fred LaRue in the Watergate affair and had espionage links that I had cataloged going to the Wallace killing. And this particular man name, he's very prominent in the White House, he was part of the Southern Strategy, and the name of the man, the second man who was with him, is the name of a person who later appears involved with the financing of the shooting of George Wallace. The name, it may not be the same person, but it was the name. Now, this man said that he had instructions to shoot John Kennedy, and that he'd be sitting next to a woman in this particular car, and that a signal came from a building directly across. There'd be a flash in his face with a mirror when he was to shoot. Now, this is the important part of the Popkind document, which I think is very important. He says he was taken to a Midwestern hotel with a middle-aged woman who spoke with a German accent, and the middle-aged woman operated under a small business cover, and that he was programmed to forget all the details, and that he was trained like a zombie, and certain words, like the word blue, would set him off. Now, I have information of a Project Blue on Monterey Peninsula by the Nazis, men wearing Nazi armbands that worked at Fort Ord or were out there a few years ago, and it was part of a plan for eventual martial law or a takeover, and they were to put chemicals into the water and contaminate in this country. And that code word was Project Blue. And the CIA has another Project Blue that I have to look up, but I remember that. But his word here for shooting, he was clued with a word like the word blue. He was programmed then to forget all the details after the shooting. He was taken to this motel by this woman, and he was trained to, as I say, to respond to these words. Now, the woman wore a polka dot dress, similar to the one worn by the woman with Sirhan Sirhan when Robert Kennedy was shot. A woman in a polka dot dress yelled, "We killed him, we killed him," and she fled. And this woman that programmed him also had a polka dot dress. He says the hypnotist who did the work was an agent in the Philippines, and he wrote Richard Popkind, and Richard Popkind had the letter filed away unopened, and he was in England teaching, or he was away. He's had it since 1970 and didn't respond and answer to the person, but when he came across the letter, he wrote to them, and now the document backs up other research. And I wish that Richard Popkind had opened the letter before he went to the Boston conference, because instead of these experts sitting down and acting like I was a bunch of crazy among these great professors, if they had listened at that time and put it together with the work I had, they would have been much farther ahead. At that time, Mark Lane claimed that I was setting the researchers back 20 years because I talked about behavior modification, because I talked about women accompanying men to do these jobs. I know in California, Mr. Frazier in Honolulu, Lawrence Kwong, who shot at KGO, Mr. Kemper, were in the company of women, famous inventors. The United States government has taken their invention, and they put women on to turn them into zombies once they took their inventions, and they get millions of dollars in contracts to invent what these people already had, and they reduced them to vegetables. And I talked about the use of these women taking these men and programming them, and that zombies were involved in the assassination. So now Mr. Popkind has taken this material to the church committee, and he said there's approximately 70 zombies walking around. And as I say, I wrote to my co-workers and asked them, would they be interested in an apology for the allegations that I made and the names that are being used now, and see the relationship of these to what I was saying, to the documents that they're just finding, because I also have documents, but they don't come and see my documents, and they didn't think it was hardly credible. As a matter of fact, the news service says that if Richard Popkind had surfaced in 1970 with this information, he would have been discounted as crazy. But in 1975, in January, when this kind of information was brought out, it was still too early. And now, in July 75, the media and the Congress, members of Congress, are examining it, and we're in a different ballgame. And the two big stories of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is the mind control and the political assassination, and the relationship of each working together. Now, who is doing all this mind control? Who is behind it? I believe that they can be pinpointed. I think the hospitals could be pinpointed. I have referred to the book Were We Controlled, written by a pseudonym Lincoln Lawrence, on the possible areas where Lee Harvey Oswald was controlled at a hospital in the Soviet Union. I also wanted to read, before I get too much into that in case we don't have time, I wanted to read a letter which I didn't bring last week, but which I talked about on the air and didn't have on time in my files to go through to bring to KLRB. I mentioned the link of the Nazis to Lee Harvey Oswald that I wrote to Simon Wiesenthal, the man in West Germany who's trying to find Nazi war criminals, to find if the Alexander Zeiger, who ran the radio factory in Russia, in Minsk, was a Nazi criminal who left Europe in 1938 and went back in 1955 and linked with Lee Harvey Oswald, because I found memos that Lee and Marina Oswald took documents out of the radio factory in Minsk and asking for the daughters of Mr. Zeiger to be taken to Argentina. And members of the Warren Commission, including Alan Dulles, were aware that the subject was brought up the CIA could be used to send these girls to Russia, from Russia to Argentina. And I wanted to read the letter on these Nazis. The reason I was concerned is that, for many reasons, that after Allende was murdered and Chile was put back in the hands of ITT, the Nazis surfaced there. Walter Rauff, who was a former colonel in the Nazi SS security office in Berlin, dealt with mass Jewish extermination. He fled Germany, went down to Chile, and now after the military junta was put in power, he became the advisor on prison administration. He was named in the Nuremberg war crimes, and now he's in Chile, where there were signs immediately after the junta, hang a Jew on every lamppost. That may explain why Mr. Pinochet will not allow the United Nations Commission on Human Rights to investigate imprisonment and torture. The former official of the SS for Adolf Hitler runs the prisons down in Chile today. The CIA was responsible for overthrowing Greece in 1967. Immediately after Greece was overthrown, German Nazis surfaced. Premier George Papadopoulos, a wartime collaborator with the Nazis, was put in control of the Greek government by our CIA. When Mossadegh was kicked out of Iran in 1954, thanks to our CIA, the son of the Nazi regime, the Shah of Iran, was put back into power. His father was a known Nazi sympathizer, and now the Shah is in full control of the oil fields of the Middle East and Persian Gulf, thanks to Richard Helms and the Central Intelligence Agency. And knowing that Nazis were behind and working with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Lee Harvey Oswald planned to go to Germany. If you don't know that, in 1958-59, he wrote to Albert Schweitzer School in Switzerland that he wanted to go to Germany. He said, in quotes, to broaden my knowledge of German and live in a healthy atmosphere and good moral atmosphere. Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend and strong man was George DeMohrenschildt, the sophisticated man whose name was von Mohrenschildt, who admitted in the 40s he worked with his cousin, Mr. Baron Maydell, known as a known pro-Nazi. DeMohrenschildt was apprehended at Corpus Christi during World War II, followed from New York down to Corpus Christi in Texas, and accused of taking photographs there of the Arnassus Pass U.S. Coast Guard station as a possible Nazi spy. So I found the letter because the Nazis in Greece, the Nazis in Dallas, and I have more information on the Nazis in Dallas-Fort Worth that I've used. I'll read you the Nazis being back, sympathizers in Iran, and around the world, the actual agents from the SS, not their children and not their followers, but the actual agents. I brought with me a letter asking Mr. Weisenthal to find Zeiger because CBS and Daniel Shore last week had an interview with a man who saw documents that Lee Harvey Oswald was in intelligence in the radio factory in Minsk. And I'm going to read you now what I wrote in 68 because the document in 75 is just servicing. March 22nd, 1968, I wrote to Mr. Simon Weisenthal, well known for finding German Nazis that fled Europe after World War II. Dear Mr. Weisenthal, are you familiar with the name of a person, living or deceased, with the following background? Mr. Alexander Zeiger, Z-E-G-E-R, in quotes, supposed to be a Polish Jew. He's from Argentina. He went there from Poland in 1938 to Argentina. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1955. He is supposed to be, in quotes, a qualified engineer. He's the head of the department of a radio factory in Minsk, Russia. The reason I'm asking is the following. I have been researching the assassination of President Kennedy since November 1963. There is evidence of a strong possible link of the Gehlen operation in Nazi Germany to our CIA, to the nest of Nazis in both Argentina and in Dallas, Texas. All of Lee Harvey Oswald's contacts in the Dallas area were with right-wing immigrant community. The strongest link of Oswald's connection with Marina Oswald, and the meeting up with Marina comes in Moscow and Minsk and centers on the foreman and manager of the factory where Oswald worked in Minsk. This foreman engineer is described as a Polish Jew who returned after the war. It is hard to visualize the Soviet Union importing these refugees from Argentina. It is easy to imagine that he entered the Soviet Union under the name of a deceased Jew who died in Poland. I'm writing the Soviet Embassy in Washington about Mr. Zeiger. I wanted to wait your answer. Among Lee's possessions, in Volume 16, page 60, of the Commission's the hearings before the Commission on the Assassination of John Kennedy, is the name of Mr. Petrikov from the Argentine Embassy in Russia. This may seem a little complicated if you're not familiar with the material. Many years and much work goes behind what I'm telling you, and the Soviet Union themselves may not be aware to this moment the relationship of Mr. Zeiger to the Oswalds. I hope to hear from you soon. Regards, Mae Brussell. I received an answer from Mr. Weisenthal. It was dated April 16, 1968, that he was in receipt of my letter, but he could not help me. The name of Alexander Zeiger was not, he says, was not familiar to me, and I have no possibility to check it out. If there's anything else I can do for you, please contact me. Now, that was the questionnaire I was asking about the possible links of Mr. Zeiger being the Nazi that worked with Oswald. There was that book I mentioned before, Were We Controlled, about Lee Harvey Oswald and his being hired in the Minsk radio factory and being a CIA agent. It suggested that he was an espionage agent. And in this book, the links of the Kennedy assassination go between Dallas, Texas, and Argentina. And the motive for the assassination, one of the motives is explained in Were We Controlled, how the New York stock market was manipulated the day that John Kennedy was assassinated, and a person named Anthony De Angelis was chosen to rock the world commodity market. Millions of dollars were exchanged, won, and lost, and Were We Controlled goes into the links of the German Bund and a corporation called Bunge and Born with the German tones. The link was from Texas, and it implied a foreknowledge of the Kennedy assassination to people in Argentina. And so I did want to read to you this letter that I was on the spot working on that back in 68, and I think if that's pursued, we'll find strong links of the CIA to the Nazis of Germany. We can't do very much in 45 minutes a week, but we'll cover more each week because it is a serious situation. It isn't a dead, issue that ended with World War II. And as we talk about CIA and assassinations, we have to think in terms of future genocide, black unemployment, race wars, food wars, weather wars, and ask ourselves, when did it begin and did it begin? When Lee Harvey Oswald was named as the patsy, Jack Ruby shot him. Did all this begin in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963? Well, that's it for this week. It goes fast for me. I don't know about you, but it goes fast for me. And I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy, KLRB, California.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.